Smith-Morra defense arises after the Sicilian defense, d4, and now this is the Smith-Morra. It's a very aggressive, tactical, and dynamic opening. It leads to open positions. You have the bishop pair usually, sacrifice pawns, basically a pawn because you're playing a gambit. There are various pawn structures. It's not very theoretical, but theory is critical. You go for kingside castling and for a kingside attack, but you also play on the c-file and the queenside, so you basically play on all parts of the board. It's a very risky opening because you are sacrificing a pawn. So the piece setup for white, as you can see here, this bishop goes to e3, f4, or g5. It has many places. The knight always comes to f3. The bishop almost always comes to c4, and the rooks go on c1 and d1, and the queen usually to e2. For black, this almost all possible piece setups are played. Knight c6 usually, sometimes very rarely knight d7, d6 pawn, and e6, e5 are also all possibilities. a6, b5 is a possibility to develop the light square bishop to b7, and sometimes the bishop after d6 can be played to d7. This dark square bishop usually comes to e7 after e6 or e5, but sometimes it goes after g6 to g7, and this knight usually comes to f6, but sometimes also to e7, and the queen sometimes to c7, sometimes to a5, sometimes to b6. The rooks usually on c8, d8, or e8. So move order discussions. This is the normal way to reach the Smith-Morra, but you can reach it from knight f3, c5, d4, takes, and now this variation leads to the Smith-Morra after e4 if black allows it, not playing f5 now. And after d4, c5, an invitation to the check Benoni. This leads to the Smith-Morra as well. Also note that after knight f3, any move transfers to the Smith-Morra with e6, g6, and even knight c6, but after d6 this usually doesn't transpose to the Smith-Morra because now knight f6 is a strong move, but if black doesn't know this, he can transpose, or doesn't want to, he can transpose back to the Smith-Morra. Even in the Baudelaire attack after d6 and this, you can transpose back to the Smith-Morra, or even after e6 you can transpose back to the Smith-Morra. There aren't a lot of similar openings to the Smith-Morra, but the open Sicilian is its closest relative because there are sacrifices on d5, as can be seen in the Smith-Morra. Here the sacrifice opens up lines toward black's king, and here also we can see that this knight d5 sacrifice can be played, and this is similar to the Smith-Morra. So the Smith-Morra Gambit hasn't had such a long history. It was first played in 1846 in a tournament game, but it didn't actually garner a lot of interest back then, even though Lionel won a very nice game. It's named after Ken Smith and Pierre Moira. Ken Smith is a famous poker player, while Pierre Moira is a relatively obscure figure, but he did champion the Smith-Morra. Ken Smith lost 3 games against world-class opposition in the Smith-Morra, and this dealt a huge blow to the Smith-Morra. But was that because Ken Smith was only an FM, or was it because of the dubious nature of the Smith-Morra? I'll go with the former. Milan Matulovic also championed the Smith-Morra, and he won a very nice game in 1957 against Brad Verevich, but unfortunately he later abandoned the opening. Nowadays, in 2019, it is seeing a resurgence thanks largely to the efforts of I am Mark Esserman, but it still needs to get more popular because it's still relatively an obscure opening against the Sicilian. So this is the summary of the lines we'll be covering today. Yes, there are a lot, but we will cover them as well as we can. And the declined versions of the Smith-Morra are far less because I included a lot of sidelines in a single chapter, the declined sidelines chapter, mostly because some of these sidelines are frankly ridiculous. So the Chicago defense arises after the following moves. Now b5, kicking the bishop, and now rook a7. The point is to go to d7 where it lines up with the queen, so bishop e3 is played, just developing a piece, maybe even supporting rook d7 or enticing rook d7, which may be seen as bad, but white wants to develop. And now knight d4 with f4, f5 ideas, making sure that this weakness on e6, because now the light square bishop can't control e6, is more pronounced. So knight f6, f4, bishop b7, even going away from e6, because what else? Where do you develop the bishop? Now f5, and after e5 we sacrifice the knight, and bishop b6 allows knight d5, rook takes f6, queen h5, rook c1 ideas. And here black's position is hopeless actually. So here instead of knight f6, bishop b7 is possible, but this still leads basically to the same thing. Now e5 comes, if bishop takes c3, the same thing. And now rook takes f8 decides, because of king e7, knight takes e6 check would be a fork. So f5, e5, and now knight d5. And if the queen moves, we take the bishop on f8, stopping castling. And if this piece is taken, we check first, takes, now takes. And now black has no way to stop. If g takes, of course, we take the rook on h8. And so knight f6 is the only move seemingly, but after g7 check, the queen is temporarily lost, but after it is taken, we take here and we get a new queen. So the Chicago defense actually isn't quite a good defense against the Smith-Morra. There's also the kind of delayed Chicago here with knight c6 inserted. So it's the same position, but knight c6 is inserted. Here instead of knight d4, we play rook d1, lining up with the rook now, and intending maybe knight d5 ideas and some other things. So now bishop e7 is played, and now knight e4. This is a very clever sacrifice. If it is taken, we take here, and after bishop b7, rook ac1 at knight b8. We can see that there is tremendous pressure on this guy, and this guy is loose in some lines, and this knight is not doing anything there. So, and after bishop e7, knight takes b5 is also a recommendation by Esselman, but here, while this position is acceptable, knight a4 has been seen as the stronger move. If instead of bishop e7, knight f6 is played, so after rook fd1, we saw bishop e7, now let's go for knight f6. Now the sacrifice by Esselman is better, and here rook takes e6. Rook takes c6 I worked out to a draw after the following line. This is drawn, but after queen c4, instead of after rook a7, bishop e7, queen c4, there's actually pressure to be had for white. Yes, here actually black is up a piece, but white has some really strong pieces. And look at black's rooks, they look very funny. White can regain some material at any point. The knight on b8 is stupid. These pieces are just defending d5, which is also stupid. So this position is actually quite good for white. So one thing to remember is the weak e6 square about the Chicago defense, and play against this weird rook, which is slightly misplaced. So now we go for this Taylor defense, and after bishop c4, now a6 is the Taylor defense. We stop for a sideline, which is knight f6. This line is actually bad for black, because after e5, white gets some huge pressure. So after d takes e5, you can also consider knight takes d5, but this loses after the following sequence, and now you don't take, but actually you make use of this tactic and you win a queen. So after e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8 check. There are two ways to recapture. After king takes d8, you go knight g5, attacking this guy, and knight a5 here is played, making sure that after check, king f7 and takes, you take back on c4, and the knight will be eventually trapped. So this is not good for white. So here white is actually forced to play bishop b5, which is still good for white, a good position. And if knight takes d8 instead, knight b5 is played, going for the fork, and now rook b8. Note that if king d7 to protect the fork, we take on e5, and now king e8 is the only move, and knight c7 would be mate. So knight takes d8, knight b5, rook b8, and now knight takes e5 forces e6. If otherwise, knight e6, protecting also against knight c7 check, we take, and simply after knight c7, we win the rook. So this line is bad. So after a6 castles, knight f6, we go for bishop f4. This is the new line. Bishop e3 is an alternative, and b4 is an alternative. So bishop f4, bishop g4, and now h3. Bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, e6, rook fd1, and queen a5, getting out of the way of the rook, queen a5. Now Esselman recommends bishop b3, but bishop e2 and bishop f1 have also been seen. Rook fd1, queen b6, queen e2, just protecting b2 and putting the queen on a good square, and now we have pressure on the d6 pawn. But after h3, bishop takes f3 isn't such a strong move, bishop h5 is stronger. And now there are two moves. Langrock's is g4. Langrock is an author of a good book about the Morra. But after bishop g6, e5 takes, knight takes, and now basically queen takes d1. This leads to a drawish endgame. White does have some pressure, but it's kind of drawish. So queen b3 is Asserman's move, it's an improvement, attacking, so now let's say if bishop takes f3, we have bishop takes f7 check, attacking f7. So rook c8 is one line that's played. There are many moves here, one of them is queen d7, there's actually knight d7, there are many moves here. But I considered rook c8 here because it's a very interesting line and shows some key ideas like the queen a4 check idea, and the bishop takes a6 idea, and maybe bishop b5, knight b5 ideas, and also sometimes lining up with this bishop, and rook d1, rook c1, rook fd1 ideas, e5 ideas. So all of these can be seen in this line and its variations. So here rook c1 is played and check, queen d7, and now the brilliant bishop takes a6, queen takes a4, takes, and now we can see this checkmate. I hope I did not go too quickly here. Do note that after bishop takes a6, b takes a6, there's queen takes a5 simply, and here in this line the rook has to be taken, and now if the bishop is taken, there's this checkmate. Now for the dragon formation, so here we can see the dragon formation, the g6, bishop c4, bishop g7, and now e5 is the pawn sacrifice line. It cannot be taken. Well, it can be taken, but it leads to a bad position for black because of this common tactic. And now knight f6. Yes, you're down a pawn here, but you do get a strong attack on the dark squares while white has a light square bishop. Opposite colored bishop endgames are drawn, or usually drawn, but opposite colored bishop middle games are quite strong for the attacking side, and here white is the attacking side. This extra pawn in the center, these two extra pawns in the center, they're not extra, but these two pawns in the center aren't so good for black because they can easily be attacked by the rooks on the e and d files, and this position actually is slightly better for white. So here after e5, knight h6 should be played, you're aiming to castle, and after castles, note that now the knight can take here, because after knight takes, bishop takes, we take the knight on h6, so castles must be played, and now bishop f4, supporting the pawn on e5, and preparing after d6 to take, and now queen takes isn't possible, which would trade the queens otherwise, but because of the bishop, so d takes is forced. And white here enjoys a nice edge because the h6 knight is misplaced, and the d6 pawn will soon be picked up, and it's a weakness, and the d5 square is also weakness. White has good pieces and excellent compensation here. And do note earlier that instead of knight c6 there's g6, but now knight f3, bishop g7, and bishop c4, d6, and queen b3 attacks the f7 pawn, and here actually bishop c4, e6, knight b5, this goes for the weak d6 square, knight f3, g6, bishop c4, and now d6, again queen b3 attacks the weak f7 pawn. So for the queenside Fianchetto variation, here we go, and black aims for a queenside Fianchetto with the early bishop b7, and now white castles. Here in this variation you should take note that early sacrifices are possible because black hasn't developed any piece and his king is still in the center while white is castled. So before knight d5, this is an early sacrifice, but it works, and bishop d6, and now rook e1 check. Note that after d6 and rook e1 check, knight bishop e7 and queen d4, this position, yes, you're down a full piece as white, but you have an attack here and attack here, you will pick up a pawn, and you have tremendous pressure with these pieces coming. So if we continue this line further, after knight f6, queen takes b4, you're attacking this bishop. You have you're stopping black from castling in the meantime because you're attacking this bishop. You have tremendous pressure with bishop f4, knight g5 ideas and stuff like that. And in queen d4, knight king f8, protecting the g7 pawn. Here you take on b4, and after bishop c8, bishop f4, you also have tremendous pressure. Look at these pieces, they're all not developed, and the king is on f8. And I should note here that after, instead of b4, there's d6, but this allows knight g5 with these kind of ideas, f4, taking on e6, and queen h5 stuff. So this is the queenside Fianchetto without, actually here we didn't cover bishop d6, so rook e1 check, knight g5, and now knight e7, now knight g5, aiming to attack f7, aiming to attack h7, and aiming for queen h5, so castles, queen h5, h6. Now after knight e4, bishop takes h6 is coming, this bishop is attacked, and actually it has no retreat square, because after bishop d7, there's actually d6. So So here queen d7, queen c7 might be tried, but after bishop takes h6, this is completely winning for white because of knight g5 ideas. So bishop takes h2. Here of course you don't capture trading pieces, so you go king h1, queen e5. Now bishop g5 prepares knight g3 and knight f6 check. This line, the Queenside Fianchetto line, we saw without knight c6. Now when knight c6 is inserted, the same ideas apply basically. Here knight a5 is a side variation. Here you must retain the bishop pair. This is my novelty, bishop b7. Now e4, aiming to stop d5 because then we take and get a good position after knight e4 ideas. So now rook c8, knight e4 still, and now bishop e7, rook e1, f5 leads to a forced line with good chances for equality, for playing for an edge for white. And queen c7, by playing for an edge, of course, I mean black is slightly better as usual in the Smith-Morra, but this line is quite pronounced if you go by engine evaluations. But actually, the position is at least a draw for white, and he has a good edge to swindle a human opponent. Queen c7 is another try for black to put pressure on c2. So bishop d3 is played, knight c4, and now we destroy the queenside structure. We go for this line where we have 2 knights versus 2 bishops. We're down a pawn, yes, but this pawn is doubled, and the bishops offer compensation as well for black, but at the same time white has good development. Black's king is in the center, he won't ever fight safety, castling kingside isn't so great, and these knights are actually quite strong. Instead of knight a5, after b5, bishop b3, we have bishop b7. Here knight d5 immediately kind of works, but we can do better. We can go for a4, and now with b4, of course, if we take, there's just simply knight takes, aiming for bishop e3, bishop b6, or knight b6 ideas. And after b4, and note that white is threatening to take the pawn on b5, so after b4, knight d5, and now this line with knight, of course the knight cannot be captured because after this rook e1 check is coming, takes. If we go with e7, so if the knight goes to e7, there's d6 idea, so this is excellent for white. If knight a5 now, bishop g5 is a nice novelty I found. f6 runs into knight e5 with various complications like takes, there's queen h5 check, and bishop g5, bishop e7, there's knight takes e7, bishop takes e7, knight takes e7, and bishop c2, maintaining the bishop pair. Yes, you're down a pawn, but you have a lot of compensation. So it's one thing to remember about this line is that you have to play against this bishop, and the early sacrifices are possible because white's king, black's king is usually in the center. So Larsen's defense. Here a6 is played, castles, and now queen c7. This aims to harmoniously develop with bishop d6 and create some threats with h5 and stuff like that. So rook e1 is played, and now bishop d6, and now bishop e3 is the recommendation by Esserman. The main line should be knight g7, rook c1, bishop b3, and now some knight d5 ideas. And here eventually you'll capture. And black does have some pressure with these 2 sniper bishops, but white also has very nice rooks on open files. But knight e5 is a second-rate move that's met with rook c1 here. Of course, queen takes c4, runs into knight d5 with a devastating attack, because knight c7 check later is a possibility, and knight b6 also. So bishop takes h2 check is played, so king h1, bishop f4, and now knight b5. So after a takes and bishop takes, we have threats here on d7, so the queen has to move, let's say to d6, and now bishop f4. If the queen takes here, we just take back with the rook and enjoy a very nice position. So queen takes f4, and now rook takes c8 check, and now queen takes d7 check after rook takes c8 will decide. There's also a sideline with knight d5, but I believe the sacrifice doesn't work. It's recommended by Esserman as a sideline, but it doesn't really work after here my novelty g6 and this setup for black. This is a relatively bad position for white. I mean, it's slightly better for black. But of course, if you don't know like 20 computer moves in this variation, you're going to easily lose as black. You're up a piece, yes, but come on, look at the king. There's a lot of difficulties ahead, especially in blitz and some such. So the Morphy defense against the Smith-Morra arises after bishop c5. There's also the delayed version after a6 castles, and now instead of d6, queen e2, rook a7, which should go back to the Chicago defense, now bishop c5, now e5 with knight e4, knight g5 ideas. So f5, and here we can see you sacrifice a piece and you do trade queens, but white has tremendous pressure. Knight c7 check later, maybe knight takes g7 check, knight takes f5, so many ideas. And after a6 castles, b5, bishop b3, bishop c5. Now and e5 now, knight g7 runs into knight e4 with knight d6 check ideas and attacking the bishop. At knight h6 also runs into knight e4 with bishop takes h6 ideas and knight d6 check, knight f6 ideas. So this line, the Morphy defense deferred runs into these ideas, and now the proper Morphy defense runs into bishop f4, knight g7, knight b5, and queen a5 check is met by the brilliant king f1, aiming for a3 b4 ideas, knight d6 check, e5, knight g5, maybe running the h-pawn like Lila and alpha 0. So some very nice ideas here. So just play against the weak and dark squares. The pin defense, it's a relatively simple defense to counteract. You castle, and now after knight g7 you go queen c2, which is Asserman's recommendation, aiming to go for bishop d3, e5 stuff, rook d1 later. Now castles, rook d1, and this relocation of the pieces, bishop d3, bishop e3, knight g5, and knight b5 if allowed, if the bishop doesn't take this knight, and this should be a positional edge for white. So the Siberian trap setup arises after the following moves, and now after bishop c4, queen c7, castles, knight f6, black aims to go for the Siberian trap. So knight b5 is played, queen b8, of course here h3, not h3, sorry, rook e1 would or queen e2 would allow the Siberian trap to take place. Actually it's with queen e2. Now knight g4, and now if h3, knight d4 just wins the game. This is a well-known trap. So knight b5, queen b8, and now e5 is a pawn sacrifice. It really cannot be taken because after this rook e1, now queen b8 runs into queen d4, aiming for bishop f4, and if instead the queen c5, there's bishop f1 with bishop e3, rook c1, knight c7 check ideas, which are very dangerous. So knight g4 must be played after e5, and now bishop f4 aiming for knight d6 check is very strong for white. He retains this pawn, the queen is kind of out of play, but a lot of play is left in this position. I should note that after bishop c4 there is also knight f6 immediately instead of queen c7. Here queen e2 needs to be played, queen c7, and now e5 and bishop f4 kind of transposes to the other line. It doesn't really transpose, but similar ideas. And after e5 there's d5, of course, takes, but now bishop g5 and takes, there's bishop takes back, so it's a very strong idea. So the Scheveningen Sveshnikov formation here we see with e6, knight f6, and now queen e2. Should note that after bishop e7, queen e2, a6, and now rook d1, queen c7. This is another variation of the Sveshnikovs or Scheveningen Sveshnikov. Bishop f4, knight e5 runs into takes, and rook ac1. So this is another variation. Castles, knight f6, queen e2, bishop e7, and rook d1, and now e5 is relatively forced. If queen c7, there's knight b5 with an advantage, and castles, there's e5 and a lot of hair raising complications you can find in Asserman's book. Rook d1, e5, and bishop e3 is Asserman's recommendation here. So e5 is played to prevent white from playing e5, so bishop e3, castles, and now this morphs into a Sveshnikov structure. Rook ac1, bishop e6, bishop g4 can be tried, but after h3, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, knight h4, there really is no good square for this bishop, and it must cede control to white's knight. I should note that after takes, queen takes, we go back with the queen, usually a3, b4 is played, and then queen a2, and this is a strong position for white. Remember the queen a2 idea, because we will see this in another line, further attacking f7. So now, after knight h4, rook c8 must be played, and the game continues. If knight takes e4, this doesn't work, because taking here comes with a check, and white is up a piece. And if bishop takes e4, g5, and if you move the knight, you lose the bishop, and if you don't move the knight, you lose the knight. So white is up a piece also. So after bishop h5, the discoveries don't work after knight h4, and neither does bishop takes e4. There's also after rook ac1 another option, which is bishop d7, here a3, and now b4 queen a2 is also played. And after rook ac1, bishop e6, b4, this is a pawn sacrifice, knight takes b4 and knight takes e5. Here white has a good advantage, and after b4 and something like a6, we just go a3, takes, and now queen a2 again, attacking the e6 pawn, and let's say queen d7 runs into stuff like knight e4, knight b6, so white has a lot of pressure and compensation for the pawn, and this pawn is doubled in this case. The Taimanov formation arises after the following moves. Now knight e7, this is the Taimanov formation, and after you castle b5, bishop b3, there's knight bc6. This line is very similar to other lines. It doesn't have a lot of independent value, but basically here you play a4 to attack this b5 pawn, as we saw in the Queenside Fianchetto formation. You go for knight d5 because black's king side is underdeveloped. You go for rook e1, aiming for knight d5 to further strengthen knight e5, and if knight g6 is played, you sometimes can play h4 as white. This is the line in Asserman's book that's called the professional's choice. So this is the professional's choice. After a6, you go knight g7. This is the professional's choice, aiming for knight g6, bishop e7, harmonious development, castling, and d5. But here bishop g5 annoys the black position, because either f6 or h6 must be played now. So let's say f6 is played. Now bishop e3 and b5, bishop b3, bishop b7, and now here a3 is a nice move I found, knight a5 and bishop a2, rook c1, queen d2, etc. kind of ideas. This f6 is a weakening move, so bishop g5 forces a weakening move, h6 is an alternative, but still bishop e3, knight g6, and now bishop b3, and you still get rook ac1, knight d5, rook e1 ideas. And if b5, also the same kind of line applies, but here actually there is a nice improvement with knight e5, because after takes there is bishop b6. Note if takes, queen takes d7 would be mate, so black must move the queen, and then white recaptures the knight and enjoys a good position. So after f6, bishop e3, there's also knight g6 to consider, but now bishop b3, bishop e7, and knight a4, aiming for the weak b6 square with knight b6 and maybe even bishop b6. This is very strong for white, so bishop b3, b5, knight d5 can be played here, making use of bishop b6 ideas with knight c7 check to follow, and if takes, you take back, and there is rook e1 and tremendous ideas with the bishop also to d4 and stuff like that. So also I forgot to mention that after bishop c4, the immediate knight g7 runs into bishop g5. Now if f6, bishop e3, knight g6 castles, bishop e7, there's knight b5, taking aim at this weak d6 square, which wouldn't be possible had a6 been played. So inserting a6 is necessary after bishop c4. So early bishop d7 lines in the Smith-Morra are highly non-confrontational, and they aim to block the rook on d1 from attacking the queen on d8, but at the same time, as we can see here, they allow bishop f4, which annoys the d6 pawn. So if it's one thing to remember of those variations, it's bishop f4, and here we transpose to a kind of Scheveningen Sveshnikov structure we saw, and this is slightly better for white, or probably just simply equal, but white has the initiative, of course, even though he's down a pawn. After knight takes c3, there's also d6, knight f3, and here bishop d7. There's no real way of exploiting it on f7 or anything, so we just castle, and after knight f6 you can play queen e2. but bishop f4 is the improvement, blocking e6 or e5. e5 is still possible, of course, but it heavily weakens d6. So h6 here is played as a kind of waiting move, also preparing g5 to annoy this bishop. But now simply e5, and white enjoys a nice advantage. So now for the Smith-Morra declined lines. The first line we will look at is after e6, there's d5, transposing to a Benoni with a nice advantage for white. And after d4, d6, d takes d5. Of course, there's queen a5 check here, but this is a well-known line in the Sicilian, which we will not get into, and this is quite good for white. After d4, c takes d4, c3. Now d5 is the Scandinavian variation of the Smith-Morra decline. This is a very complex variation. Let's take note of g6, knight f3, bishop g7. Now knight f3 is played, aiming hoping for black to transpose back to the dragon formation, accepted. But if he still denies and wants to play the Smith-Morra declined, you finally take the pawn here, and if e6, you finally take the pawn now. After c3, there's also queen a5, but now bishop d2 simply lines up with the queen, aiming for c takes d4, and white gets a good center. And after e5, knight f3, and knight c6, bishop c4, knight g5, you play knight f6, you play knight g5. So e5 against the Smith-Morra, and the Smith-Morra declined heavily weakens the f7 pawn, so you play like the Italian, knight f3, bishop c4, knight g5. And after c3, d6, there's simply c takes d4, and you enjoy a nice center. So c3, d5 is the final variation we look at on the declined sidelines. It's the Smith-Morra declined Scandinavian, d5, e takes d5, queen takes d5, and now you must take back. Knight f6 runs into bishop b5 check, and now if knight d7 blocking, you win back the pawn. And if bishop d7, you simply go back to c4, protecting the pawn, then followed up by queen takes d4. And at any point, you're not afraid of this, because you go back to a regular Smith-Morra accepted, which is fine for you, for white. So queen takes d5, and now c takes, and knight c6. Knight f3, bishop g4, and knight c3, and bishop takes f3. Asselman recommends in his book g takes f3, but I prefer knight takes d5 here. Takes, knight d5 check, knight c7 check, and king d7 runs into takes, bishop h5, and now d5 with very complex complications, but white gets an advantage in this line. After knight c7 check, if we consider the other king move, king d8, we take, and now after bishop h5, we play f3. So the Alapin arises after the following moves. Knight f6 is the Alapin, so play this, and now you have to take the pawn, d6, bishop c4, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, and now queen e2, aiming for rook d1, knight c3 kind of plans. So knight c3, takes, and now queen a5, bishop d2, just simply protecting the c3 pawn, rook fd1, rook d8, and rook e1, with kind of bishop d3, bishop c2, queen e4 ideas, attacking this king. Note that after d6 also we take, and now if e6 we take with the knight, and here we play g3. It's a nice positional line, but with aggressive intentions. And now knight c6 runs into bishop c4, knight b6. So after knight f3 we have knight c6, bishop c4, knight b6, bishop back. Now if d5 takes, and we castle here, and bishop e6, there's knight a3, aiming for knight b5 ideas. e4, c5, d4, c takes, c3, d3, bishop takes, and now so the push variation is with d3 takes, and of course if d5, there's bishop b5 check, picking up a pawn. So bishop d3, d6, and now c4, knight c6, and we get into the structure. So here the idea for white is to play queen e2, rook c1, bishop back to b1, protecting everything, and putting the bishop on a square where it doesn't interfere with the white pieces. Rook d1, knight d4, knight d5, b3, and f4. This is the entire setup. You can play this almost by force as white, and the black is almost helpless to stop this idea. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about pawn structures in the Smith-Morra. There are a lot of them, and each requires a specific type of concrete play. But the Scheveningen formation lends its way to strategic thinking, so we can talk about it. As in the normal Sveshnikov, there's a hole on d5. It's a dynamic position. White enjoys a better pawn structure, but black has the more dynamic chances and the easier breaks. So as in the normal Sveshnikov, white's plan is to control d5 and attack d6, but unlike the normal Sveshnikov, there's an open c file because white sacrificed the pawn there. So white can control that usually with rook ac1. And black's plans include the d5 break and controlling c4. So the positional themes, there's a hole on d5, white must control it with pieces, in general a knight on d5. Black controls more central space, so white needs to watch out for that, and also make sure that to know that e takes d5 for white is generally a very bad idea, because it stops the d6 pawn from being a weakness, and it also denies the white pieces the d5 square. And d4 is a chronic weakness for white. Be careful of the d4 square, lest a black knight lands on it, and an eternal black knight annoys you on that square. Actually, the d4 square is called the Achilles heel of the Smith-Morra by Mark Esserman. The knight d5 sacrifice is quite common in the Smith-Morra. You can see it in this line. It's a side line here. Here you play b4 to win the knight on f5. But then your bishop would be hanging on c4, so you play this so that if queen takes d8, you take the knight on f5, and if rook takes d8, now you do this. And now we see also the bishop f7 idea, also knight g5, aiming for h7 and f7. And here take note that after d6, knight f3, and this line also in the Taylor, we get to see knight d5. Here, of course, knight d5 isn't the sacrifice knight d5, but it's a tactical motif to go to b6, so also something you need to keep in mind. And in this side variation, you also get to see the knight d5 as a pure sacrifice. And here again, there's rook e1 ideas and a lot of stuff happening. So the knight d5 sacrifice, you need to know like the back of your hand in the Smith-Morra. For example, for the bishop takes f7 check motif, we get to see here this motif taking place in the line we know, and d6 bishop c4 again from the lines we looked at. Also here in the Taylor, if the immediate bishop g4 is played, this runs into this tactic as well. So the knight takes f7 motif arises in the following lines. Here, of course, it's with a check and you win a rook. And after b4 in this line, knight f7 here is played, ending this check and then this check, picking up the knight. And in this line, we can see knight f7 here, aiming to go for queen takes e6 with a decisive pin, and after king takes f7, this line, of course, if g6 just takes, and here this line is also quite good for white. If knight takes e6, this is another tactical motif that's less common than the others. Here, after knight g8, this comes into fruition. You're a piece down, but you have queen h5 check ideas. Of course, here if d takes e5, you can do this, aiming for queen b6 check, maybe even a4 later. Aiming for queen e6 check, and later a4. And here in this line, white enjoys a nice edge. So double rooks plus some minor piece endgames are common in Smith-Morra endgames, as we can see, for example, in this line. Here you get two rooks versus two rooks and two bishops versus two rooks and two bishops. Here, for example, this is another line, basically a queenless middle game with the entire set. And after knight takes c3, knight c6, knight f3, this line leads to the following endgame, and this line leads to the following endgame as well, where white has chances to create a passed pawn on the queen side. And after knight f3, knight c6. This line from Langrock's book also leads to this kind of situation, 2 rooks and 2 bishops. So if you want to learn the most common Smith-Morra endgames, this is it. It's basically 2 rooks and some minor pieces. Endgames with a single rook and some and king at pawn endgames are also common in the Smith-Morra, as you can see from this line. So this is a rook versus a knight situation. White controls the open file. This can be studied. Look at Capablanca's endgames. And this line from the Van Wheelie game leads to a king and pawn endgame, where this is supposed to be drawn, but white has chances, I think, if black doesn't play accurately. After e6, this kind of line here leads to a very complicated endgame, where finally it's rook versus rook, but white with the active king munching on these pawns, and this passed pawn will be able to win. Usually in this position will be able to win. Imbalanced material endgames, surprisingly not that common in the Smith-Morra, but somewhat well represented. So here they are. There are 2 lines which lead to these imbalanced endgames. This is one of them. Here white should win. 2 rooks, 2 minor pieces versus a rook, but white enjoys 2 extra passed pawns on the queen side. And the other line arises after this. And a very complicated battle here, but now this line arises. White does have the exchange, but he's a pawn down. Actually, sorry, he's 2 pawns down, but the rooks do have open foils, so it's kind of equalish. So for the model game, we'll take a look at this game against Sarkar. Asserman here really very quickly beat 2400, so it's an excellent game. It also showcases the ideas of the Morra, like the knight d5 sacrifice. This is what we saw earlier. This entire line we've seen in the theory section. Now after queen c7, bishop f4, aiming for rook e1 and rook c1. This is played, and here knight g5 decides, because knight f7 would be mate. So if queen takes b6, knight c7 would be mate. So an excellent game by Asserman. It's a really model game, and it's a very, very, very short miniature. Note that after queen d4, bishop e7, we have this line, and here you pick up the bishop, of course. So bishop e7 would not really be possible. After queen takes b4, here queen c7 should not be played. Instead, bishop c8 should be played. This is an improvement over the game, but it's difficult to see. So the bibliography, Mayhem in the Morra by I am Mark Asserman, a very popular streamer. It's an amazing book, the latest book on the Smith-Morra, and very detailed. The Modern Morra Gambit by A Dynamic Weapon Against the Sicilian by Langrock, Hans Langrock, also published a year earlier than the Asserman book, but very excellent and well worth the read. Developments in the Smith-Morra Gambit, it's more of a historic book by Afam Neil Carr. Very interesting to see how it developed. How to defeat the Smith-Morra Gambit, this introduced by I am Timothy Taylor. This introduces the Taylor defense, and the Smith-Morra accepted a game collection and the declined versions by Ken Smith, the namesake of the opening, and Bill Wall, a very popular chess writer. These are very nice books featuring game collections, so they're kind of more resistant to the passage of time. And winning with the Smith-Morra Gambit, this is the third very important book you need to know about the Smith-Morra. It's by F.M. Graham.
and it's a very nice book as well. So alongside the Langrock and Asselman books, they are excellent. The Smith-Morra Gambit Feingold Defense, this introduces Feingold's refutation to the Smith-Morra. Feingold, of course, a very popular streamer and YouTuber, and Bob Chiafone, a very well-known poker player. Trends in the Smith-Morra Gambit, Volume 2 by a woman FM Natasha Regan, who co-authored a very nice book with GM Matthew Sadler, Game Changer, about Alpha Zero, and woman GM Susan Lalick, a very strong player. It's a nice book to see the trends in the Smith-Morra Gambit also.
So for Nassar's Novelty Corner, here 95 is a rare move, but I consider this one of the best options of meeting the Mora. Now after bishop c2, keeping the bishop pair, there is bishop b7, and this line we saw. This line has actually been played by Lila against Stockfish in this super final. Lila actually, Stockfish actually found this black line on its own, and Lila responded with this white line on its own. What else? Also here, against the immediate bishop b7, there's a4. This move was found by Berg, but I consider this my own because I found it on my own. And after b4, knight d5, knight a5, bishop g5 is my own novelty. This hasn't been played. Runs into now this line we saw, and rook e1 is also a possibility. Also against the Scandinavian, I have this, the Smith-Morra Scandinavian, I have this line. Here e5, theory books say either knight f3 or knight c3. Now queen takes d4 is universally played, followed by knight b5. But now I found bishop d2, keeping the queens on the board, and this is basically almost the only way to keep the queens on the board after e5. So a very nice novelty I found for Smith-Morra Gambit players, because they like keeping the queens on the board. For knight takes c3, e6, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, now a6. Here my novelty was for black with g6, and after knight c6, bishop c4, bishop here against the Morphy defense, I found bishop f4, knight g7, knight b5, and now king f1 with the h-pawn idea. This is also my novelty. Also here after knight e4, I found the novelty as black with queen c7, and this position we saw earlier. That's it for my novelties, so I have quite a few novelties in the Smith-Morra.
So opening theory suggestions for tactical or positional players. So if you're a positional player, don't play the Smith-Morra Gambit, man. It's a very aggressive opening, you can't play it positionally. Yes, there are some lines where you can choose a tactical or positional options, but they are so rare that I didn't bother including them. And if you are in general a positional player, don't play the Smith-Morra Gambit. You need to know how to sacrifice, and sacrifice well, because you're down a pawn, and you need to play with the initiative, or else this pawn deficit will show in the endgame. Other openings like the London system, for example, you can play tactically or positionally. You can play it very aggressively or very meekly. But in the Smith-Morra, there aren't really such diverse options. You have to play it tactically. So if it's one thing to remember about the opening, it's to attack. Because if you don't, you're just down a pawn. And with that, thank you for watching.